Good evening or good morning or whenever you find the time to watch this webinar. I want to welcome you to the final installment of our virtual November series. And I'm thankful for the time that I've had with you so far and thankful for those who have found some time to watch the other ones as well. We've been posting them on YouTube. And so if you're not sure where to find those from the last previous 3 weeks, just let me know. Tonight we're going to finish off with the topic of raising the next generation of global citizens. And this is a topic that I'm still wrestling with. The other topics covered in other webinars as well are things that I still am learning about. And so I just want to offer you some food for thought and open up the conversations to whether we are doing this, whether we're even thinking about it, and how to do it better. And so if you're wondering why Edudeo would choose to focus on this topic, I think the connection is that we at Edudeo, this is our mission, is to advance Christ-centered education for children worldwide. And I would argue that Christ-centered education must include global citizenship and developing global competencies in our students. And this is something that's important based on what we read in the Bible. I hope to point out some of those items tonight as well. And we're going to talk about 4 basic questions and try and start to answer them anyways. First of which is, what is global citizenship? What is global competency? What is a global competency or global competence? How are they related together? Why are these things important for students' lives and for our lives as well, of course, not just students, we're lifelong learners, and how can we develop global competence through curriculum and pedagogy? And so to start off, talk about some of the terminology here. So to be a citizen, if we're talking about being a citizen because you were born into a certain region, then you have no choice. If you're born into a certain city or town, and you grow up there and you are gifted with rights and privileges and duties, that is not a choice that you have to make. And likewise, I think it's not actually a choice for us to be a global citizen or not. All it takes is looking at the items in the room that you're in right now and determining where those things came from. And likely they came from all over the world. Or you can look at your phone and see where the news reports are coming from, or where the stories are coming from, or who you are interacting with. And again, likely you have plenty of interactions with the larger world beyond just your own city or town or even country. So I would argue that everyone is a global citizen. Now, just like you have choices as to whether you want to be a productive citizen of your town or your city and to be involved in it and aware, you have choices whether you want to be a global citizen that is aware of what's going on and has a realization of what impact you have on people across the world even. And so there are ways in which you can cultivate that, and which we can cultivate that in our students as well. So one definition I found for global citizenship is this. It refers to a sense of belonging to a broader community and common humanity. So a very basic definition. So again, I would say that everyone fits into this category. Another definition goes like this. A global citizen is someone who's aware of and understands the wider world and their place in it. They take an active role in their community and work with others to make our planet more peaceful, sustainable, and fairer. But I'd actually argue that that kind of definition is more so talking about a global citizen with a high level of global competence. And so what is the difference then between citizenship and competence? Well, each person, each global citizen can have varying levels of global competence. And so competencies, when we try and measure this, we measure it by looking at various skills and sets of knowledge that people have. And we can call those global competencies. One definition of a global competency says they are a list of the knowledge and skills students need for the 21st century or needed to be a highly competent global citizen. So there is an organization called OECD, and they have put together a way of measuring global competence in students. So the OECD stands for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and they have developed a framework, and it's called the PISA Global Competence Framework, and that stands for Program for International Student Assessment. And it's a formalized way of measuring global competence in this case, high school students. They really focused on 15-year-olds when they did the assessment process. So I'm just going to use that framework because I think they do a good job of listing the different competencies and explaining them well. And I'm going to use that as a way of describing the different skills and knowledge bases that students should have in order to have a high level of global competence. So it's not the be all and end all. There are different frameworks out there. I'm choosing to use this one. I recommend you have a look at what they have to say on their website. If you just do a Google search of them, you'll find lots of information. So what they do in the framework, in the PISA framework, is they divide competencies. And again, competencies are the skills and knowledge that students need to be highly competent as global citizens. And they divide them into 4 dimensions. So I'm going to list them as a pyramid, and I'll explain why. The first dimension. So you can think of dimensions as categories of global competencies. So we're going to get more specific in each of these colored categories. The first one is students should be able to critically examine local, global, and intercultural issues. The second tier or second level, and I'll explain why I have them as a pyramid in a second, is students should be able to understand and appreciate different perspectives and worldviews on those issues that they just looked at. They should be able to engage in open, appropriate, and effective interactions with people from different cultures. And then they should be able to act for the collective well-being and for sustainable development. So I drew these, or I represented these as tiers or parts of a pyramid because it makes sense that students have to know about issues first, and then they have to be able to understand that there are different perspectives on these issues and appreciate them and develop their own perspective as well and compare it to others. Then we want them to be able to engage with others. It doesn't really do much good if you know kind of what perspectives are out there. It's most helpful if you can then talk and communicate with those people, and then to be able to act on these things to work towards solutions. And so it's tiered because you need a foundation. You just keep growing on it. It reminded me of a Bloom's taxonomy type of idea. Now, PISA, P-I-S-A, they represent these categories, these 4 dimensions, 4 categories in this type of diagram. So the dimensions are in the teardrop looking shapes there. And then around the outside, they have what they call 4 inseparable factors. So the knowledge, values, attitudes, and skills, they are infiltrating all of the dimensions, which is why they're represented as a circle around the outside as opposed to distinct items. So they need to know, they need to develop skills, they're developing values in a Christian setting, in a Christ-centered education. Our values are based on the word, of course. The attitudes are be shaped that way as well. And they're infiltrating all these different dimensions of global competency. So what I'd like to do with you is to go through some of the competencies that are listed in the PISA framework, and I put them into quotation marks because they're basically straight from the document, and then briefly just discuss why I think it's important that students have these competencies in a more kind of concrete way. There are more things you could add to the list of why it's important. I thought I'd just give you a few to think about and hopefully encourage you and convince you in a way that consciously incorporating methods into your teaching that develop these competencies is really important. The first one, a globally competent student can understand that the world is a system in which their actions, as well as the actions of nations, have consequences across the globe. So why is that important? Obviously, it's important that students understand that their choices matter, and not just for themselves. They're not just out to act on their own behalf, but realize that they're part of a greater system, a greater network of people. And now that we have technology, for example, our network is huge. It's global now. We have impact on people that we don't even know. To also realize that these systems, that they are broken, and also why they're broken. They're broken because of sin. We are not working well together because of sin and the effect that it still has in our world. And so if you listen to the third webinar on poverty, we talked a lot about this, that there are 4 overall broken relationships because of sin, and that's with God, with others, with ourselves, and with creation. Globally competent students can also use what they know to develop an informed opinion about issues such as poverty, economic opportunity, inequality, environmental risks, conflicts, etc. So the point is not just to know and leave it at that. The point is to think critically and to look at, again, in a Christ-centered education, what the Bible has to say about this, and to develop a well-informed opinion based on these things. And why is that important? Again, understanding brokenness, understanding the problem better helps us to work towards solutions. And we know in this sinful world, this sinful age, we'll never be able to do this perfectly, but we are working towards this through the work of the Holy Spirit. We also are able to understand true joy and contentment better and fight materialistic attitudes that are so prevalent, especially in our North American culture. What I mean by that is when you understand more about poverty, and perhaps we're even able to experience it. Maybe you went on a trip and you visited a coffee farm where the coffee farmers are not being paid nearly what they should be compared to the retailers and other parts of that supply chain and what they're getting. It's difficult to come back and to not see our parts of our own lives, not to drink that coffee here and not think about those experiences. When you know more about something, it changes how you look at your own life and what you find to be important and where you find your joy. And so this knowing about what's going on in the world can help you to appreciate that. Again, you can see how these broken systems and relationships point to the need for a savior. We're not going to save the world. Christ is only going to do that ultimately when he comes back again. But we can work towards mending those relationships with his help. Globally competent students can also formulate questions, they can analyze data, they can evaluate arguments and counter arguments, they can choose and communicate relevant evidence to back up their ideas and determine trustworthiness of information based on the source. In today's day and age, this is a difficult thing to do with so many different news sources out there. It is hard to even sometimes develop these skills in students because as adults, we find it difficult to know what to believe and what not to believe. This is the world that we're living in. And yet we have to keep trying, keep developing those skills and giving practice doing these things. So obviously, knowing how to evaluate arguments and develop an opinion based on good information helps us to make decisions based on the best information that we have. And we can also understand in knowing that every single piece of media is written by a person and people have biases, whether they believe they do or not. We all have worldviews that are shaping what we think, and really you can't be completely objective about anything. So to understand that human nature is that way, and the only truth that we really have in our lives is based in the word, is coming directly from God, is something that we always have to remember, especially when determining where to get our information from. So the second dimension is about understanding and appreciating that there are different perspectives and worldviews on certain things. And so a globally competent student considers global problems and behavior of other people from multiple points of view and how different factors affect people's worldviews. So we have a Christian who has received the Holy Spirit and believes that the Bible is the Word of God, they will have that as their basis. But if someone does not believe in the Word, they're going to look at a certain issue in a different way. And just understanding that there are different points of view and that the Bible allows for different points of view on certain things, doesn't allow it on other things, is something to work through. So this is important to practice humility and empathy. So humility in that there are certain things where there are certain points of view and they aren't necessarily wrong, allows students to realize they don't have all the answers for everything and that their perspective on something isn't the only perspective to have. And looking outside themselves and understanding that knowing their creator more deeply, every person who you meet who has a different perspective, because everyone's made in God's image, you're seeing a little snippet of what God is like in those people. And when we start to see that, even in that homeless person on the street, that there's God reflected in that person, that helps us to know God better as well, and also to be more empathetic to that person, to appreciate them and respect them more, and also appreciate beauty in that diversity, and that it's not all about butting heads. Globally competent students can appreciate that people have a great deal in common, enabling them to get past differences as much as possible. There will always be a conflict between the world, so to speak, and God's people, and we're called to be different in the world, but not of it. So there will always be those differences there, and to understand where they lie is important, of course, but to always be focusing on differences is not a healthy thing either. And we have to remember that God's people are coming from all walks of life. That's biblical. That there are Christians everywhere in the world, and they may not be doing things exactly the same way. They may not be worshiping exactly the same way as we do here, and yet, again, there's room for that. That can still be God glorifying. And so to recalibrate our minds to think that way, we can view others as potential assets. So what can we learn from other people instead of focusing on what we don't agree on? Understanding that there's a lot to learn and to build on by knowing these other perspectives and views is important. The third tier is to engage. So once students know different perspectives, the skills needed to actually have a conversation and work with somebody who has differing opinions, even if you agree to disagree, having those skills is incredibly important too. So globally competent students can understand that people from different cultural backgrounds might interact in different ways. And they also make an effort to adapt their behavior and style of communicating to the norms of the person with whom they're interacting. So beyond that, there's different viewpoints, different ways of thinking. How can we still engage each other and talk it through and learn from each other and do that in a productive way? So this is important for simply the fact that in a student's life, more and more, they will have opportunities to interact with people from very different backgrounds. Again, largely because of technology and the different jobs that are available and travel. And additionally, perhaps more importantly, being able to engage people to be able to share the gospel with them. How can you possibly share Christ's love with somebody if you can't even interact together at all? You can't even have a conversation or invite each other into each other's lives. It's just not going to happen if you're not communicating properly. Globally competent students can effectively express their beliefs, state their needs, ask questions, attempt to change someone's mind, or handle a difference of opinion. I like that it says handle a difference of opinion because it implies that we cannot all agree on everything. That's impossible, and actually there's something pretty beautiful about that too. But doing so, being able to do so, express what you believe, and disagree well is not always easy to do and takes practice and takes learning. So why that's important, we can defend God's word and challenge the ways of the world in an effective and influential way. We can disagree productively and not, again, just have butting of heads. We can live cooperatively in multicultural communities. We can listen for understanding and not immediately for judgment as well. And the last tier is about acting. Now that you know these things and you know different opinions and you can work together, what do you do with that? So globally competent students can respond effectively and responsibly to a local, global, or cross-cultural issue or situation, which is important. This is as concise as I can get it. It's important so that you can help without hurting. And that implies helping someone who has needs that you can provide for, but the opposite is also true, making sure that you also aren't hurt in the process. If you've read the book that was referred to in the third webinar, When Helping Hurts, that's largely what that book is about, is how we determine what the real problem is to make sure that we're actually meeting the needs instead of making it worse for both sides. Globally competent students can also fearlessly stand up for others when their rights or dignity is threatened and feel empowered and obligated to do what they can on behalf of others. When it comes down to it, we are simply commanded to take care of those, especially those in need. And that's found throughout the Bible. So simply obeying your Creator and living in obedience to what He has said in His Word is one huge reason why it's important. It also reflects the character of Christ to hopefully lead others to Him. That's a way that He can use us, is when we as a community, when we as individuals are not content to sit by and just know about what's going on, but feel the need to do something about it. And then they can also recognize how God has provided them with different gifts and different talents to be able to have a response and to work together with other people to use their different gifts and talents to come up with a response and do that in a way that is God glorifying. So a lot of information there. Like I said, we could add to it on either side, what skills are needed and why they're important, but something to think about. So how do we do this? How do we develop global competency or global competence in our students? I just want to give you a couple ideas of how to do it. I'm sure there are plenty of teachers out there who could add to this list and have lots to contribute, and hopefully we can have those conversations at some point. Here's just something to start with. So in your classroom, what you teach is the curriculum, and how you teach it would be the pedagogy. So what you teach. I would say that global education is not an embellishment, it's a thread. And so it works its way through the entire curriculum. It's not something you tack on. It's not something you can just teach within one lesson and then leave it and move on to the next thing. If it's taught well, it actually comes up over and over and becomes more of a theme or a thread than something that is kept in a silo by itself. There is a document that I found that helped me to think more about the Christian perspective on global competencies and global citizenship. And it came out of the Anglican Church out of the UK. So an interesting read. Wouldn't say I would agree with everything they had to say, but this one quote really stuck out to me, and I would agree with it. It said, "There's a very natural fit between global education and the Christian ethos of a church school, or we might call it a Christ-centered school or a Christian school. The more aware you become of issues of global poverty and inequality and of Christian perspectives on these issues, the less the question seems to be, how does global education fit with our school ethos, but rather, how can global education not be deep at the heart of all we do in a church school?" So as opposed to how do we shove it in to what's already there, how can we effectively teach Christ-centered education and not have global education as part of it? Do they have to work together? I would say they definitely do, for reasons mentioned before. So the beautiful thing about this is if you read through your curriculum document, I guarantee you're going to find references to global education in there already. And oftentimes, if there is room for choice for the teacher, for example, when I've read through high school English curricula, there are so many opportunities to use different types of media. And in your classroom. And so if you have choice, then to go to maybe unconventional sources. But like I said, the curriculum already has so many things built into it. So I would recommend using a variety of media from different sources, maybe even what might be considered controversial sources, things that you're not used to using or that perhaps you as a teacher wouldn't even agree with or promote, but teaching students how to look at different documents and to pick out those things, how to think critically about those pieces of writing or those videos, whatever the case may be, is important too. Ask community members to be guest speakers. Again, those could be people who don't have a Christian perspective, but it allows students to, in a safe space, have opportunity to still be able to talk with people and communicate effectively and find similarities and all these types of good things. At Judeo, of course, we are available for guest speaking as well as a community member. As far as how you teach it, just a couple tips. Again, this list could go on and on. I just picked a few example things. Encourage lots of questions. So when we talked about the importance of knowing or understanding or exploring different perspectives, we as teachers have tendency to cut the conversation short when we kind of hear what we consider to maybe be the right answer, but consciously encouraging more questions or more perspectives is helpful for students to A, feel comfortable about sharing their own thoughts, and B, just seeing where different people's thought processes are coming from. Include varied experiences, so not just in the classroom, but school-wide, community, internationally. COVID makes this difficult to do. We acknowledge that, and it can be a frustrating time for that reason, but there are ways to do it. There's Zoom, for example, concrete piece of technology that's been very helpful to just get creative in that way to bring more people into your class or give students different kinds of experiences where they have to talk to and communicate with different types of people beyond their own peers and teachers. Diversify your methods, so structured debates. Debates aren't just for English class or drama class or something like that. They can help students to communicate within their own peer groups and to practice listening well and practice explaining their own opinions well is important. Project-based learning, PBL, hits all of these competencies really easily. And so there's lots of opportunity there. If you're interested in project-based learning, don't know anything about it, give it a Google search or reach out to me. I can point you in the right direction and we can talk about that. It's very fruitful, rewarding way of doing things. Service opportunities, again, COVID makes this really difficult. However, looking for opportunities to interact with your own backyard or even internationally is worthwhile to do. Constructing code of honor, what I mean by that is basically a code of behavior, but maybe that sounds a bit more negative. So I like the code of honor idea. And that, again, goes back to the importance of listening to each other and developing skills of communication. I highlighted, this is one that I did with one of my grade 9 classes a couple years ago, and some of the things they came up with, this is totally student generated, by the way. There are ways to do that. Again, that's a separate conversation, but students came up with these things, and some of them are related to the global competencies that we mentioned. Recognize diversity within groups and culture. So even how you speak, practicing that and being careful about certain pitfalls that are very easy to fall into, such as making statements like, in Africa, people do this, or this is an African necklace, as in making it sound like all of Africa is painted with the same brush, that it's all the same. And yet it's very, very different. So simply just watching out for language that you use. Encourage exploration of similarities as well as differences. There's a lot of value in looking at how different people live different ways, but a lot of value in looking at how they're similar too, and building those connections between groups of people that otherwise wouldn't even realize they had connections. Ensure displays, books, photos portray a balance. For example, rural, urban, rich, poor. Just again, different media sources using different kinds of pictures, different kinds of books, and being aware of what kind of message they can portray without you even realizing it. So making it lots of different or exploring variety is important. Celebrate what's going on that is going well in regions that have been negatively stereotyped. We'll go back to the Africa example. Many students, especially younger students, might think of Africa in very stereotypical ways without realizing it. It's so looking at what is going on that's really positive and encouraging and is going well in these places. So if Edudeo is talking about one of their partner countries, we too we want to celebrate the things that are going well and acknowledge that there are things that are broken, that there are needs that are there, but there's also so many blessings that are happening too, and making sure those get mentioned and focused on too. Have a proper posture when it comes to poverty. This is a really important one that is difficult to just summarize. So again, reading books like When Helping Hurts, having a look at that webinar just to give you something to think about might be helpful as well. I did an email out to the group that's on the webinar list. I emailed out some reflection questions just to get you to think about how your school has incorporated global education, whether it is a priority, whether it's just a consequence of what's already going on, whether it's something that could use work. And so I recommend that you just have a look at that, think about your own classroom and your own situation. I'm sure there's always improvements to be made and things to learn. And that is about it for me. So this was part of a series, like I said. There are 4 in the series, and they're all going to be on YouTube shortly. If you ever have comments about them, please let me know. If you ever would like to explore these types of issues and topics with your own students, there's lots of opportunity for that too, including student versions of these presentations and other ways you can get involved as well. So just reach out to me, lkoning@edudeo.com, and let's work together. So thanks for joining me again, and blessings in your work.